January 17th, 1945, Northern Apennines, Italy. The stone farmhouse crouched against the mountainside like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Dawn had not yet broken over the snow-dusted peaks, and in the darkness before first light, 3 women sat around a table made from salvaged barnwood, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of German artillery, a sound so constant it had become part of the landscape itself, like the cry of wolves or the rush of mountain streams. Inside, Maria Benedetti wrapped her raw, frost-bitten hands around a clay cup filled with roasted barley water. She raised it to her lips, closed her eyes, and pretended, as she had pretended every morning for 3 years, that it was coffee. She was 24 years old. Before the war, before the Germans came, before Mussolini's regime collapsed and civil war tore through Italy like a serrated blade, Maria had studied literature at the University of Bologna. She had read Dante in ancient libraries where sunlight filtered through stained glass, had sipped espresso in marble-topped cafes where intellectuals debated philosophy and art. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this frozen mountain hideout not merely by miles or months, but by an unbridgeable chasm of violence and loss. The coffee she remembered, real coffee, dark and bitter and rich, had become in her memory something more than a beverage. It had become a symbol of civilization itself, of a time when mornings meant possibility rather than survival, when the future stretched forward with promise rather than dread. Across from her sat Giulia Rossini and Anna Ferrara, fellow partisans in the Franchi Brigade, one of dozens of resistance groups operating in the Gothic Line's brutal terrain. Giulia had been a schoolteacher in Modena. Anna had worked in her family's textile factory in Prato. Now they were soldiers, saboteurs, couriers carrying messages through German lines, their former lives reduced to photographs hidden in jacket pockets, images of people who no longer existed. They wore men's coats scavenged from dead soldiers, German, Italian, it no longer mattered, layered over wool sweaters unravelling at the seams. Their boots, stuffed with newspaper for insulation, bore the stains of mountain mud and melted snow. And every morning they gathered in whatever shelter they could find and drank their barley water and called it coffee. Because some rituals must be maintained, even when stripped of all meaning. Because even in war, human beings require small ceremonies of normalcy to remember who they once were. The Allied advance had stalled. After liberating Rome in June of 1944, American and British forces had pushed northward through the Italian peninsula with what seemed at first like unstoppable momentum, believing they would reach the Po Valley before winter. But Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, had transformed the Apennine Mountains into a defensive fortress of devastating effectiveness. The Gothic Line, a network of fortified positions, minefields, artillery emplacements and machine gun nests stretching from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic coast, had absorbed the Allied offensive and ground it to a bloody standstill. By January of 1945, the war in Italy had devolved into a frozen nightmare of attrition warfare that resembled the Western Front of 1917 more than the mobile campaigns of modern mechanized conflict. Into this stalemate, the Italian partisans had become not merely useful but essential. Operating behind German lines, they gathered intelligence on troop movements and supply routes, sabotaged communications infrastructure, ambushed convoys, and tied down German divisions that might otherwise reinforce other fronts. The Allies estimated that partisan operations across northern Italy engaged the equivalent of 6 full Wehrmacht divisions, approximately 70,000 German soldiers diverted from direct combat to security operations, reprisal actions, and anti-partisan sweeps. But the cost had been catastrophic. German counterinsurgency doctrine, refined through years of brutal occupation warfare across Europe, operated on principles of overwhelming retaliatory violence. For every German soldier killed by partisans, Italian civilians died by the dozens. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were burned to ash. Women and children were executed in town squares as warnings. The mathematics of resistance warfare in Italy had become a grim calculus of sacrifice. Each act of defiance weighed against inevitable reprisal. Maria and her companions had joined the resistance not from ideology but from desperation, from the recognition that neutrality itself had become impossible. After the Italian armistice of September 1943, when the Italian government surrendered to the Allies and Germany immediately invaded from the north, every Italian had been forced to choose: collaborate with the Germans and the puppet fascist regime of Mussolini's Italian Social Republic, flee to Allied lines, or resist. Those who chose resistance did so knowing the likely outcome. The average life expectancy of an active partisan in northern Italy was measured in months, not years. They fought without uniforms, which meant they fought without protection under the laws of war. Captured partisans were not sent to prisoner of war camps. They were tortured for information, then executed. Their bodies were often left hanging in public squares, warnings rendered in human flesh. And yet they persisted. They persisted through the winter of 1944, when snow closed the mountain passes and supply lines disappeared, and men and women froze to death in their sleep. They persisted through German offensives that swept across the mountains like wildfire, scattering partisan bands into isolated pockets, hunting survivors through forests and valleys. They persisted on diets of chestnuts and thin soup and barley water that mocked the memory of real sustenance. They persisted because the alternative, submission to an ideology that had reduced their nation to rubble and their countrymen to slaves, was worse than death itself. But persistence and survival are not synonymous. By January of 1945, the partisans of the northern Apennines were not merely hungry and cold. They were approaching the edge of physical and psychological collapse, that threshold beyond which the human organism begins to consume itself, burning through reserves of will and hope as thoroughly as it metabolizes fat and muscle. Maria set down her cup of barley water and listened to the pre-dawn silence. In the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of pine smoke from some other hidden shelter where other partisans huddled in the darkness, waiting for enough light to move, to act, to continue the slow and grinding work of resistance. She thought, as she often did in these quiet moments, about coffee. Real coffee. The memory of it had become almost hallucinatory in its intensity, the dark richness of the aroma, the slight bitterness on the tongue, the warmth spreading through the chest like a small sun kindling to life. She knew it was absurd to fixate on something so trivial when surrounded by death and destruction, when friends were executed weekly and villages burned monthly, when the entire architecture of civilization had collapsed into barbarism. And yet the mind, when confronted with overwhelming trauma, often focuses on small, absent comforts precisely because they are manageable. Because grief for lost coffee is emotionally survivable in ways that grief for lost brothers and murdered children is not. She did not know, could not know, that 50 kilometers to the south, 3 American officers attached to the Office of Strategic Services were at that moment loading pack animals for a journey northward through German lines. She did not know that among their supplies, wrapped in oilcloth and packed with the care usually reserved for ammunition or medical supplies, were several kilograms of actual coffee, the genuine article, procured through military supply channels specifically for this mission. She did not know that within 72 hours she would hold that coffee in her hands and weep not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that somewhere in the world people still remembered that life could mean more than mere survival. The Office of Strategic Services had been created in 1942 as America's first centralized intelligence agency, tasked with coordinating espionage, sabotage, and resistance operations across all theaters of war. While the agency's exploits would later be romanticized, the daring parachute drops, the midnight assassinations, the elaborate deceptions, the reality of OSS operations in Italy was often less dramatic and more logistically complex than popular imagination would later suggest. The primary mission was not to kill Germans, though violence certainly played a role, but to transform scattered resistance groups into an effective auxiliary force capable of supporting Allied military objectives. This required not merely weapons and training, but something more fundamental: the establishment of trust between American military personnel and Italian civilians, who had every reason to distrust foreign armies. Italy in 1945 had been invaded, occupied, or traversed by German, American, British, French colonial, Polish, Brazilian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian forces, among others. The country had become a proving ground for every Allied nation's military ambitions, a landscape where international divisions jockeyed for position and prestige, while Italian civilians died in the crossfire. Into this environment came OSS operatives like Captain Thomas Ritchie, Lieutenant James Morrison, and Sergeant Paolo Benedetti, men whose mission profiles included not merely military objectives, but psychological ones, the delicate work of convincing exhausted partisans that continued resistance served purposes beyond their own destruction. They had studied the reports. They knew the statistics. The partisan brigades of the northern Apennines were approaching collapse, not merely from German pressure, but from the slow erosion of will that comes from fighting a war that seems to have no end. Supplies that arrived sporadically and in insufficient quantities had undermined faith that the Allies took partisan operations seriously. Weapons drops that included British Sten guns without corresponding ammunition, or American carbines without maintenance tools, or explosives without detonators, suggested either incompetence or indifference. The partisans fought on, but they fought with diminishing confidence that their sacrifices mattered to the distant generals planning offensives in heated headquarters, or to the politicians in Washington and London, for whom Italy had become a secondary theatre, an afterthought in a global conflict increasingly focused on the drive into Germany and the Pacific campaign against Japan. Captain Ritchie understood that equipment alone would not solve this crisis of morale. He had grown up in Boston's North End, the son of Italian immigrants, speaking Italian at home and English at school, navigating between two worlds. He understood something that many American military planners did not, that material abundance, while strategically significant, also carried profound psychological weight. The United States did not merely possess more tanks and aircraft than its enemies, it possessed more of everything: more food, more clothing, more small comforts and minor luxuries. And the deliberate sharing of those comforts, the conscious choice to expend resources on items without immediate tactical value, communicated a message more powerful than any propaganda broadcast: that the Americans fought not merely to win, but to restore a world where abundance was shared, where life meant more than survival, where morning coffee was not a memory but a reality. He had requisitioned the coffee through official channels, listing it as supply materials for indigenous resistance forces. The supply sergeant had looked at him with undisguised skepticism. Coffee was heavily rationed even for American troops, and here was an OSS captain requesting enough for an entire partisan brigade. But the requisition was eventually approved. Ritchie understood that this coffee represented more than caffeine and flavor. It represented normalcy. It represented a moment when Italian partisans could close their eyes and remember who they had been before the war, and imagine who they might become after it ended. It represented, in the most literal sense, a taste of the world they were fighting to restore. The journey north took 3 days. They moved through valleys still contested between German rearguards and Allied patrols, navigating minefields and checkpoints, their pack animals laden with weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, and those precious packages of coffee. They travelled at night when possible, hiding during daylight hours in barns and caves, guided by partisan couriers who materialized from the landscape like ghosts, and disappeared just as quickly. The Gothic line was not a fixed boundary, but a fluid zone of violence, where control shifted daily, where no ground was truly secure, where farmers in the morning might be corpses by afternoon for the crime of being in the wrong place when a German patrol needed to demonstrate authority. On the third night, they reached the partisan encampment in the mountains northeast of Pistoia. It was not a permanent base. The Germans had learned to locate and destroy fixed positions, but a temporary assembly point where multiple partisan bands had gathered for what they hoped would be a coordinated operation against German supply lines. The Americans arrived to find perhaps 80 partisans, men and women ranging in age from teenagers to grey-bearded veterans of the First World War, unified only by their shared exhaustion and their determination to continue fighting, despite all rational reasons to surrender or flee. The meeting took place in a shepherd's hut that stank of sheep and smoke and unwashed humanity. Maps were spread across a makeshift table. Intelligence was shared, arguments conducted in rapid Italian, punctuated by the occasional English phrase when precision was required. The operation being planned involved simultaneous attacks on 3 German ammunition dumps along the road between Florence and Bologna, coordinated to occur during a predicted Allied artillery barrage that would confuse German responses and prevent effective reinforcement. The partisans possessed the will and courage for such an operation. What they lacked was the equipment and supplies to sustain it. Captain Ritchie let the planning session continue for nearly an hour before he mentioned the coffee. It was deliberate timing. He wanted them to understand first that the Americans took their military capabilities seriously, that weapons and ammunition and radio equipment were being provided, that this was not charity but military partnership between professional forces. Only after establishing that foundation did he signal to Sergeant Benedetti, who left the hut and returned carrying one of the oilcloth packages. The reaction was immediate and far more powerful than Ritchie had anticipated. Giulia Rossini, the former schoolteacher, reached out to touch the package with a tentative gesture, as if it might dissolve under her fingers like a mirage. Anna Ferrara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and Maria Benedetti, no relation to the American sergeant, though they shared the coincidence of a surname, simply stared at the package with an expression Ritchie would later describe as resembling religious ecstasy, a face transformed not by physical beauty, but by the sudden and unexpected arrival of grace in a graceless world. "Real coffee," she whispered in Italian, and the 2 words carried weight beyond their linguistic meaning. Real coffee. 2 concepts that had become separated, that had diverged into the realm of memory and imagination, suddenly reunited in physical form. They opened the package with reverence, hands trembling not from cold but from emotion. The coffee was American military issue, ground and vacuum sealed in tins designed to survive parachute drops and long-term storage. To the Italian partisans, accustomed to the elaborate rituals of espresso preparation, this pre-ground coffee represented a kind of alchemy, the transformation of something sacred into something practical, the American genius for taking the elevated and making it accessible, for democratizing excellence through mass production and efficient distribution. They had expected perhaps to dislike it, this industrial coffee that bore no resemblance to the artisanal preparations of Italian café culture. But when the first pot was brewed over an open fire, when the aroma began to fill the cold mountain air, such critical distinctions evaporated. Maria was the first to drink. Captain Ritchie had insisted, had poured the cup himself and placed it in her hands, recognizing in her face that particular quality of deprivation that goes beyond physical hunger into spiritual starvation. She raised the cup to her lips. The coffee was black, unsweetened, still hot enough to burn. She took a small sip, letting it rest on her tongue for a moment before swallowing. And then she wept. They were not tears of sadness, though sadness was surely present. Grief for all the mornings without coffee, for all the friends who would never taste it again, for all the normalcy that had been destroyed and might never be fully restored. They were not tears of gratitude, though gratitude was there too. Appreciation for these American soldiers who had carried coffee across a war zone, who had understood that human beings require more than ammunition to continue fighting. They were tears of recognition, the sudden, overwhelming awareness of what had been lost and the equally sudden possibility that it might someday be regained. They were tears that acknowledged the past while glimpsing the future, that mourned and hoped simultaneously, that accepted both the reality of present suffering and the potential for eventual healing. She was not alone. Around the fire, other partisans wept quietly as they drank their coffee, tears running down weathered faces, emotions too complex for language finding expression in salt water and silence. Men who had killed and watched friends die, who had endured torture and witnessed atrocities, who had cultivated the emotional armor necessary to function in conditions of sustained trauma. These hardened soldiers cracked open in the presence of real coffee, allowing themselves for just a moment to feel the full weight of what they had endured and what they had lost. Giulia Rossini held her cup with both hands, warming her frost-damaged fingers against the metal, and remembered her classroom in Modena. She remembered teaching Petrarch to teenagers who fidgeted and daydreamed, who complained about homework and gossiped about romance, who inhabited a world where the greatest crisis was a failed exam or unrequited love. She wondered how many of those students still lived. She wondered if, when the war finally ended, anyone would remain who remembered how to teach literature, who believed that poetry and beauty and philosophical inquiry mattered in a world that had demonstrated with such brutal clarity that power and violence were the only currencies with guaranteed exchange rates. Anna Ferrara drank her coffee and thought about her family's textile factory, about the particular sound of the looms at full production, that rhythmic mechanical heartbeat that had marked the hours of her youth. The factory was gone now, destroyed in an Allied bombing raid that had targeted the German garrison billeted in the warehouse next door. She had watched it burn from a mountainside 3 kilometers away, had seen her family's legacy of 4 generations reduced to rubble and ash in the space of an afternoon. She understood intellectually that the bombing had been necessary, that the war required such sacrifices, that her personal loss was insignificant compared to the larger strategic imperatives. But understanding and acceptance are not the same. The coffee she now drank tasted simultaneously of comfort and loss, of the world that had existed before the factory burned, and the uncertain world that might exist after the war ended. The Americans watched, uncertain how to respond to this outpouring of emotion over what they regarded as a routine supply item. In the American military, coffee was ubiquitous, brewed in vast quantities at every base and forward position, available in canteens and mess halls, taken for granted as a basic component of military logistics. American soldiers complained about its quality. It was too weak, too strong, too bitter, never quite right, but they never questioned its availability. The idea that coffee could be scarce, that it could become an object of longing and desire, that its absence could represent a form of psychological deprivation as real as hunger or cold. This was foreign to men who had grown up in a nation where abundance was not exceptional but ordinary, where supply chains functioned with such reliability that their very existence became invisible. Captain Ritchie understood more than his companions. He had seen his parents weep similar tears during the Depression, when letters arrived from family still in Italy, when news reached Boston about hardships and hunger in the old country, when the distance between American plenty and European scarcity became emotionally unbearable. He had learned then that abundance was not merely material, but moral, that the capacity to share resources carried ethical weight, that generosity was not charity, but recognition of common humanity. He understood that the coffee they had brought into these mountains was not simply a tactical tool for improving partisan morale, though it would certainly serve that function. It was a statement of values, a declaration that the America they represented fought not merely against fascism, but for a vision of human dignity that included the right to small comforts and minor luxuries, the right to begin each morning with something more than fear and deprivation. The planning session resumed after the coffee had been distributed and consumed, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The partisans spoke with renewed energy, their arguments more animated, their strategic thinking more aggressive. The operation that emerged from that night's discussion was more ambitious than originally planned, 5 targets instead of 3, coordinated not merely with Allied artillery, but with a diversionary operation that would draw German security forces away from the primary objectives. It was the kind of complex, multi-phase plan that required confidence in execution and faith in support. The kind of operation that exhausted, demoralized fighters do not attempt because the risks outweigh the likely gains. But they were no longer exhausted and demoralized, or rather, the coffee had not eliminated their exhaustion and demoralization, but had reminded them that such states were temporary rather than permanent conditions. The difference is subtle but profound. To fight while exhausted, believing exhaustion to be your permanent state, is to fight without hope, to engage in violence as an act of despair rather than purpose. To fight while exhausted but remembering that restoration is possible, that normalcy can return, that mornings might once again begin with coffee and conversation rather than fear and deprivation. This is to fight with hope intact, to endure present suffering for the sake of future possibility. Over the following weeks, that coffee became legendary among the partisan bands of the northern Apennines. The story spread through the informal networks of resistance communication, growing with each retelling. American OSS agents had brought real coffee to the Franchi Brigade, not emergency rations, not military substitutes, but actual coffee. The symbolic weight of this gesture far exceeded its material value. It suggested that the Americans, unlike previous occupiers, and unlike the Germans currently destroying Italy in the name of defending it, understood something fundamental about what human beings require to maintain dignity in the face of sustained adversity. The operation planned that night succeeded beyond expectations. All 5 ammunition dumps were destroyed simultaneously, the resulting explosions visible from Allied positions 50 kilometers south. German security forces, drawn off by the diversionary operation, arrived too late to prevent the attacks or pursue the partisans effectively. Allied intelligence estimated that the loss of those ammunition stocks delayed planned German defensive preparations by at least 2 weeks, potentially saving hundreds of Allied lives during the spring offensive that would finally break through the Gothic line in April of 1945. But the military success, while significant, was not the operation's most important outcome. Word of the coffee spread, and with it a larger message, that the Allies, and particularly the Americans, valued Italian resistance contributions not merely as tactical assets, but as human beings worthy of consideration and respect. Other OSS teams, hearing of Rich's coffee diplomacy, began incorporating similar gestures into their supply missions. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned fruit, condensed milk, items that American military logistics could provide in abundance, that cost little in strategic terms, but carried enormous psychological weight. The partisans fighting in Italy's mountains learned that their suffering was seen, that their sacrifices mattered, that they were not merely expendable tools in a larger strategic game, but partners in a shared struggle against an ideology that had reduced human life to mere resource in service of state power. Maria Benedetti continued fighting with the Franchi Brigade through the final months of the war. She survived the German spring offensive of February 1945, when Wehrmacht forces attempted one last desperate push to break partisan control of the mountain passes. She survived the Allied spring offensive of April 1945, when American and British forces finally shattered the Gothic line and swept northward into the Po Valley. She survived to see German forces in Italy surrender on May 2, 1945, to witness the bodies of Mussolini and his mistress hanging by their heels in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, to watch Italian cities attempt to rebuild from rubble and ruin. When the war ended, she returned to Bologna. The university had survived physically, though most of its records had been destroyed or scattered. She resumed her studies, completing a dissertation on Dante's treatment of coffee in the Inferno. A joke, since Dante had lived centuries before coffee reached Europe. But also not entirely a joke, because the dissertation explored how contemporary readers might interpret historical texts through the lens of absence and longing, how the lack of something in a text could be as meaningful as its presence. She became a professor eventually, teaching literature to students who gradually forgot that coffee had ever been scarce, who inhabited a post-war world of increasing abundance and prosperity, who took for granted the very things their parents' generation had fought to preserve or restore. She kept one item from her partisan days, an empty coffee tin, American military issue, dented and faded. She used it as a pen holder on her desk, this artifact of a moment when the simple act of drinking coffee had carried the weight of civilization itself. Students sometimes asked about it, and she would tell them the story. The frozen morning in the mountains, the American OSS agents, the coffee that tasted like hope and grief simultaneously, the tears that had come unbidden and unstoppable. Most students listened politely and forgot the story within days, but occasionally a student would understand, would grasp that the tin represented more than nostalgia or sentiment, that it symbolized the recognition that human dignity requires more than survival, that freedom includes the freedom to experience small pleasures without fear or deprivation. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze the Italian resistance from every conceivable angle: military effectiveness, political composition, relationship to the Communist Party, coordination with Allied forces. Academic papers would debate casualty figures and operational impact, would attempt to quantify the strategic value of partisan operations in terms of German divisions pinned down or supply lines disrupted. These analyses were valuable and necessary, the essential work of transforming lived experience into historical understanding. But they often missed something fundamental, something that could not be easily quantified or reduced to statistical significance, that resistance is ultimately a spiritual condition, as much as a military one, that the will to fight requires the capacity to remember why fighting matters, that human beings cannot indefinitely endure deprivation and trauma without something to remind them that better conditions are possible. The coffee that Captain Ritchie brought to the mountains in January 1945 represented in microcosm the larger ideological conflict at the heart of World War II. The Axis powers had constructed their ideologies around concepts of sacrifice and deprivation, around the notion that greatness required the subordination of individual comfort to collective purpose, that luxury was decadent and abundance suspicious. Citizens of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had been taught for years that enduring hardship built character, that suffering purified the spirit, that the acceptance of poverty and deprivation demonstrated patriotic virtue. This ideology had a certain austere appeal, particularly during the early war years, when Axis forces seemed invincible, when sacrifice appeared to produce tangible results in the form of military victories and territorial expansion. But by 1945, the bankruptcy of this ideology had become evident. The promised greatness had not materialized. The suffering had not purified, but merely depleted. The hardship had built not character, but despair. And increasingly German and Italian civilians and soldiers found themselves confronting an opponent whose ideology operated from fundamentally different premises. That abundance was not suspicious, but desirable. That comfort was not decadent, but democratizing. That the goal of civilization was not to cultivate suffering, but to eliminate it wherever possible. The United States had entered World War II with industrial and agricultural capacities that dwarfed those of any other nation. American factories produced aircraft and tanks and ships in quantities that seemed impossible to Axis planners. American farms generated food surpluses that fed not merely American soldiers, but Allied populations across the globe. This abundance was not accidental but systemic, the result of decades of investment in infrastructure and technology, of political and economic systems that incentivized efficiency and productivity, of a national ideology that viewed prosperity as an achievable goal rather than a zero-sum competition. And critically, American military and political leadership understood that this abundance was not merely a strategic advantage, but a psychological weapon, that demonstrating material superiority could undermine enemy morale and strengthen Allied resolve more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The coffee brought to Italian partisans illustrated this principle perfectly. It cost the American military almost nothing. A few kilograms of coffee represented an infinitesimal fraction of American logistical capacity, a rounding error in supply calculations that moved millions of tons of material across oceans and continents monthly. But to the partisans who received it, that coffee represented proof that abundance existed, that the deprivation they endured was not humanity's natural condition, but a temporary state imposed by a destructive ideology, that the world they were fighting to restore or create would be characterized not by shared suffering, but by shared prosperity. This was the true significance of Maria Benedetti's tears on that frozen morning in January 1945. She wept not merely for the coffee itself, though the coffee was certainly important. She wept because the coffee represented recognition that her suffering mattered, that her humanity was seen, that the forces she fought alongside valued her not merely as a tool but as a person. She wept because the coffee demonstrated that another way of organizing human society was possible, that nations could choose abundance over scarcity, generosity over hoarding, solidarity over competition. She wept because for 3 years she had inhabited a world that seemed designed to crush hope. And suddenly, unexpectedly, hope had arrived in a vacuum-sealed tin carried by American soldiers who understood that victory required not merely defeating the enemy, but offering a compelling alternative vision of human possibility. The Italian resistance was not unique in this regard. Similar dynamics played out across occupied Europe, wherever resistance movements confronted the choice between continued struggle and surrender or collaboration. The decision to resist was never purely strategic. It was always at least partially emotional, driven by values and beliefs that transcended tactical calculation. And the Allies, particularly the Americans, learned that supporting resistance movements required more than weapons and tactical coordination. It required demonstrating that the Allied cause represented not merely a different political configuration, but a fundamentally different approach to human dignity and social organization. This is why the coffee mattered. This is why Maria Benedetti kept that dented tin on her desk for the rest of her life. This is why she told the story to her students year after year, even knowing most would not truly understand. Because the coffee represented a moment of clarity in the chaos of war, a moment when the larger ideological stakes became visible not through abstract political theory, but through the concrete reality of a shared cup of coffee. A moment when the promise of democracy and freedom materialized not as rhetoric, but as aroma and taste and warmth spreading through a frozen body. In the final accounting, World War II was won by industrial production and military logistics, by soldiers willing to fight and die, by strategic decisions made in headquarters distant from the battlefield. But it was also won by countless small acts of recognition and solidarity, by gestures that acknowledged shared humanity across national and cultural boundaries, by the understanding that victory required not merely defeating fascism, but offering a compelling alternative vision of how human societies might organize themselves. The coffee brought to Italian partisans in January 1945 was one such gesture among thousands, insignificant in isolation, profound in aggregate. 70 years later, in cafes across Italy, people drink espresso without thinking about its absence during the war, without remembering that their grandparents fought and died for the freedom to begin mornings with coffee and conversation, rather than fear and deprivation. This forgetting is both tragedy and triumph. Tragedy because it loses the memory of suffering and sacrifice. Triumph because it represents the successful creation of a world where coffee is once again ordinary rather than precious, where abundance has become so common it no longer registers as remarkable. But the tin remains on the desk in Maria Benedetti's old office at the University of Bologna, preserved now as a historical artifact, a reminder that freedom and democracy are not abstract concepts, but lived experiences, that they manifest in the presence or absence of small comforts, that they require constant defense and renewal. The students who pass that office, hurrying between lectures with their takeaway espresso cups, rarely pause to consider what the dented tin represents. But occasionally, one stops. One reads the small placard explaining the tin's provenance. One begins to understand that the coffee their grandmother fought to preserve was never really about coffee at all, but about the right to live in a world where mornings mean possibility rather than fear, where abundance is shared rather than hoarded, where human dignity includes the freedom to experience small pleasures without the shadow of deprivation and death. This is the legacy of that frozen morning in January 1945, not merely military victory or political liberation, though those were certainly achieved, but the deeper recognition that civilization requires more than survival, that human beings need beauty and comfort, and minor luxuries to remember why survival matters. That the fight against tyranny is ultimately a fight for the right to ordinary joy, for the simple, profound grace of beginning each morning with real coffee among friends, remembering the past without being consumed by it, imagining a future worth the cost of achieving it. Maria Benedetti understood this. In her final years, suffering from the illnesses that decades of malnutrition and hardship had seeded in her body, she would sometimes ask her caretakers to brew coffee, real coffee, not the bitter substitutes of wartime, and sit with the cup warming her age-twisted hands, breathing the aroma, remembering. Remembering the Americans who had carried coffee across a war zone because they understood that hope could be measured in small tins and shared cups. Remembering the partisans who had wept because a moment of normalcy had arrived when they had stopped believing normalcy would ever return. Remembering that the war they fought and won had been about more than territory or politics, more than competing nationalisms or ideological abstractions, but about the fundamental question of how human beings might live together, in deprivation and fear, or in abundance and hope. When she died in 2003, her funeral was attended by former partisans who remembered the war, and young people who knew it only through stories. The priest, conducting the Catholic burial rites, mentioned in his eulogy the coffee tin that had accompanied Maria through decades of peacetime life, that ordinary object that had become extraordinary through the weight of memory it carried. And at the reception afterward, in a cafe near the church, mourners gathered to drink espresso and remember a woman who had fought so that such gatherings would be possible, so that mornings would mean coffee rather than barley water, so that the world would choose abundance over scarcity, generosity over cruelty, hope over despair. The coffee they drank that day was excellent, the espresso perfectly extracted, the crema golden and rich. It tasted of nothing but itself, bitter, aromatic, dark. It carried no weight beyond flavour and caffeine, and in that ordinariness, in that transformation from precious to common, lay the ultimate victory of the war Maria had fought, the final justification for tears shed over coffee on a frozen mountain morning 80 years before. Because freedom, in the end, is nothing more and nothing less than the right to ordinary joy, the right to begin each morning with small ceremonies of normalcy, the right to live in a world where coffee is simply coffee, precious not for its scarcity, but for the memories it carries and the future it represents.